Mr. Johnson.
Whenever Muhammad Ali would get an introduction like that, he'd always begin with the same joke. He would say, "Why, thank you for that lovely introduction. You're not as dumb as you look." That was Ali. You can only get away with that when you're 6'3" heavyweight champion of the world and the most beautiful man on earth. So I wouldn't do that. And it's important to note, actually, that Ali and I do not have that much in common. You might have picked that up by looking at me. We do have one thing in common. We both have an astonishingly fast jab. Amazingly quick jab. You want to see my jab? You want to see it again? That's another Ali joke. I could stand up here all night and do Ali material and you'd go home happy. But I make the point about not having much in common with Ali because it's important for a biographer to recognize that his job is to try to understand his subject, to try to empathize with his subject, to try to help the reader understand his subject, but that you don't necessarily have to have anything in common to do that. What you have to have are certain tools that are important for a biographer. You have to have a tolerance for ambiguity. You have to have a willingness to do deep dives in research. You have to be willing to have doors slammed in your face. I did something like 500-600 interviews for this book. It took me about 4 years of work. I sponsored original scientific research looking at Ali's speaking rate and how the number of punches he took over the course of his career affected his speaking ability, looking for signs of cognitive decline. I got to know all 3 of his living wives. He was married 4 times. One passed away before I began this project. And I interviewed everyone from his brother to his opponents in the ring, all in the quest to try to understand another person. You might say to yourself, the very act of biography is an act of hubris. How can anyone attempt to tell another person's life story? Right? What right do I have to claim that I know what Muhammad Ali's life meant? And in fact, Dick Gregory, the great comedian and activist, when I interviewed him, he was one of the first people I interviewed for this book. He said to me, "White boy, you got a lot of nerve attempting something like this, and if you're going to do it, if you're going to make sense of Muhammad Ali's life, I think there's one question you've got to answer. You've got to be able to tell me what made this kid think he could be special. Because for any kid to think he could be special is a great leap of imagination, but for a black young man growing up at the time that we did, and Gregory and Ali were almost the same age, they were also the same age as Emmett Till, which Dick Gregory pointed out. Black people of that generation were raised under the rules that suggested that they were inferior, that they could not speak up to power, that they could not go around calling themselves the greatest, that they could not gloat over their white opponents. For Ali to think that he could do that, for him to think that he could get away with breaking the rules that applied to everyone else, was extraordinary. And my task was to explain what made him think he could get away with it, and then how he could get away with it. The biographer's job is to try to understand, try to follow his own curiosity, and then bring the reader along on that journey. So where do you begin? As I said, 500-600 interviews. I couldn't keep track of them after a while because sometimes his wives were calling me 20-30 times a day. But where do you begin? No one gave me permission to write Muhammad Ali's biography. I did not go to his wife or his children. I did not go to his management company and ask for permission to do this. I decided that this was a story that needed to be told. I was a huge Ali fan as a kid. Had his poster on my ceiling. Literally the last thing I looked at, first thing I looked at every day. And as a kid, I don't think I remotely understood why he was special. I understood why he was a special athlete. But I didn't understand why he was special to society. Maybe I had a glimmer of it. Maybe I understood that there was something different about this guy. But it wasn't until I was much older that I appreciated how much he meant to us as a country, how much he changed us as a people, and what it meant for him to stand up against the war the way he did, what it meant for him to stand up against racial expectations the way he did. And it occurred to me that nobody had written his biography. Now you might be surprised to hear that because there have been hundreds of books about Muhammad Ali. But nobody had written a complete biography. And when that occurred to me, I thought it was the greatest opportunity that I would ever have. And I immediately felt like this is the best book I could possibly write. And it was as if someone had left a suitcase full of, of cash, or the most beautiful girl in the world is looking at you from across the room. How could this be? How could no one have taken up this challenge yet? So I just decided I was going to do it with no one's permission. And the first thing I did was to approach Ali's second wife, Khalila. Now you might say, why is she the first person of all? She was obviously an important person in his life. She was married to him from 1967 to 77, some of the most interesting years in his life. But the real reason is that she just happened to be in Chicago, where I live. She was at a movie premiere, and just after I'd had this idea to do Ali's biography, and I approached her at this movie premiere. This is the way the picture was taken at this movie premiere. And I said, "Hi, Mrs. Ali, my name is Jonathan Ike, and I want to write a book about your husband, and I was wondering if we could arrange an interview." And she said, "Well, who the hell gave you permission to write this book?" And I said, "Nobody, but I really want to do a good job. It's really, I think his life has not been explored in the way it should be. Enough time has gone by that we can appreciate what he meant to history. And you were such an important part of that. You were there for the years that he was banned from boxing. You were there for the years that he was out in the wilderness and couldn't make a living. You were there for the years when he joined the Nation of Islam. I need to talk to you." She said, "Okay, fine. I'll give you an interview. $6,000. And I said, "Okay, why $6,000? Why not $5,000? Why not $7,000? How did you come up with that number?" She said, "Well, that's how much I got paid from the last journalist who wanted an interview." So I said, "Well, I don't pay for interviews. I don't think it's ethical." And she didn't really care about my ethics. She just wanted money. But I began, so I got her cell phone number. I started showing up when she came to Chicago again. She was selling dental insurance plans at nursing homes. And I would just show up at the nursing homes and talk to her while she was waiting for suckers to come along. And I'd take her out to lunch, and she got to know me a little bit, but she still wouldn't do the interview. Then I began interviewing other people. I found a guy named Lowell Riley, who was the official photographer for the Nation of Islam for the 60s and 70s, living in the south side of Chicago, still had all of his photos, all of his negatives in his house, thousands and thousands. He had some of Ali's, he had posters from he went everywhere Ali went, and he was in Ali's home. He took pictures of the family. He was there when the babies were born. He took wedding photos. And so I snapped a few pictures that he had laying around the house, and I texted them to Khalila. And she said, "Where'd you get those pictures?" And I said, "Well, if you let me come interview you, I'll bring you some of them." And she eventually began to succumb to my charms, or my stalking, whatever you want to call it. And I went down to Florida. She lives in Deerfield Beach, and I interviewed her there, and she decided that she was going to cooperate with this book. And that, moreover, I was going to help her write her autobiography someday, which I'm hoping we may get around to, not holding my breath. But Khalila began to tell me about their lives together. And I began to feel like I was on my way. I was gaining trust of some of the key people around Muhammad Ali. Then I went, my next target was Ali's brother, Rahman Ali, who was born Rudy. Of course, you know Muhammad Ali was Cassius Clay. His brother, Rudy Clay. I called Rudy on the phone. I said, "Rudy, I'd like to interview you for this book I'm writing about your brother, Rahman." I'm sorry, I called him Rahman. He says, $1,000. So better than $6,000, but I still wasn't going to pay. And I started calling him over and over. I would call sometimes, I'd say, "Rahman, I have one question, just one question. What was your dog's name?" He said, $1,000. I said, "That's a terrible name for a dog." He said, "You know what, that's not funny, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not telling you the dog's name, I'll tell you anything else unless I get $1,000. So it turns out that Rahman is really living he's having a hard time. He's living in poverty, he's on food stamps and welfare, he's in public housing, and I found out that Ali's former manager, Gene Kilroy, was sending him $500 every month. So I asked Gene if I could just be the delivery boy and bring him the $500 the next month. And that worked. I got an interview with Rahman, and then the next couple times I went down there, we were friends, we got along, and he didn't ask me for any more money. One time I went down and I said, "I'll take you to any restaurant you want in Louisville. I'm not paying for interviews, but I'm happy to buy meals. Take you to any restaurant you want. Pick the nicest restaurant." We get in the car, we're driving for like 45 minutes. Where the hell are we going? Louisville's not that big. And we get to this place, this is a picture there. You see the little soy sauce bottle. It was $6.99 all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. And he said, as we're pulling, he says, "It's $5.99 for seniors." But Rahman started to tell me the stories of what it was like. I mean, you cannot get much a better source than women Ali was married to, then brothers who grew up sharing a bedroom. The Clay family lived here in the West End of Louisville. Ali and Rahman shared a bedroom. The house was about 800 square feet, and I actually went and measured the distance between the two houses. If you look on the right, 72 inches between the two houses. I measured it because I had a line where I said the view out Ali's window, out of young Cassius Clay's window, was the next house over, 72 inches away. And young Cassius used to stand in the gap between those two houses and have his brother Rudy throw rocks at him so that he could practice dodging the rocks. That was just his idea of fun. Maybe helped prepare him for a career in boxing, who knows. But it's important to know a few things about the way Cassius Clay grew up. Obviously, he grew up in the South, in segregated South, in the Jim Crow South, born in 1941, when schools were still segregated. His father was a sign painter, so worked on his own and expressed to his son that that was a symbol of pride for him, that was a source of pride, that he didn't have to count on the white man for a paycheck. He believed, as Marcus Garvey taught, that the black man was never going to get a fair deal in America, that the only real way the black man was going to be treated well was to leave America and to go back to Africa. Ali's mother, Odessa, was a housekeeper and cook for white families in the better parts of town. But this was a pretty good neighborhood by the standards. There were a lot poorer neighborhoods than this in Louisville. Most boxers come out of poverty. Cassius Clay did not. Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. did not. This was a working class neighborhood. There were school teachers and principals and even some dentists and a couple of lawyers on this block, an undertaker across the street. And they grew up seeing people go to work every day. And that was important. One of the neighbors of Ali's was Georgia Powers, who went on to become the first state senator in Kentucky, the first African-American woman and the first African-American to become a state senator in Kentucky. So this was a block where people had ambitions. Now, young Cassius Clay always loved attention, always loved being in the spotlight, always trying to get people around him to look at him, but he struggled with how to do that. His father was a drunk and was abusive. He felt like he could never please his father, and he was dyslexic, so he was unable to read until he could read a little bit by the time he got to high school, but he was virtually illiterate through his grade school years, and couldn't really understand why he was doing so poorly in school, and really struggled for a way to win approval. He found that way to win approval when he discovered boxing. How many people know the story of Muhammad Ali's stolen bicycle? A few. Often there are these creation myths. How someone became who they are. This is the great creation myth of Muhammad Ali, and often these creation myths turn out to be myths. They turn out to be completely false. This one, I'm happy to report, turned out to be true, which is really refreshing for me as a writer, because it doesn't happen that often. Cassius Clay was riding his bicycle. He had a very nice $50 Schwinn. It was a Christmas gift. He and his brother had to share it, so Rudy was on the handlebars. And they're riding through downtown Louisville. They passed a Cadillac dealership where Cassius would always look in the window and say, someday I'm going to have one of those. And it starts to pour. They jump off the bike and they go into a building where there's a fair going on, and they get some free popcorn and stuff at this. It's like a housewares fair. When they come back out, the bicycle's gone. It's been stolen. They're worried sick that they're going to get beaten by their dad when they get home. This was an expensive, brand new bicycle. This is the building that they ducked into to get out of the rain. Columbia Auditorium, now part of Spalding University. And when they come back out and they find their bicycle stolen, they go looking for a police officer to report this. And somebody says there's a police officer in the basement of the building. They go down there, and there's a white police officer named Joe Martin who's running a boxing club. And Ali is so stunned by the sight of the boxing, the smell. He's hypnotized by the sight of this that he almost forgets about his bicycle. But then he says to the cop, Joe Martin, somebody stole my bike, and if I find out who did it, I'm going to beat the crap out of him. And this police officer says, do you know how to fight? And Cassius says, no, but I'm tough. And the police officer says, well, why don't you come back and learn how to box? And two really important things happen in that moment. First of all, he's being offered help and kindness by a white police officer. His father has always told him to stay the hell away from police, especially white police officers. Nothing good can come of it. His father's been arrested at least half a dozen times for drunkenness and for fighting. And here's a white police officer who wants to help him. And then he looks around and he sees in the boxing ring black and white kids fighting each other. He sees black kids punching white kids, getting away with it, and in fact being encouraged to do that. And that's not supposed to happen in the world as his father has explained it to him. So here's a universe inside the four posts of the boxing ring that seems to have different rules from the universe outside the boxing ring. And this fascinates him. He also learns that some of these fighters are going to be on TV. That there's amateur fights every Friday night in Louisville, and if you're good enough, you can get on TV. And this really lights him up. He not only comes back to the gym and begins to work with Joe Martin, he finds another boxing trainer, an African-American one, across town, and when he's done training with Joe Martin, he goes across town and trains again at this other gym. He becomes the hardest worker in Joe Martin's gym, begins not only training hard, but when his fights are on TV, he actually goes around and knocks on doors telling people that he's going to be fighting that night. One day, he wanders into a white neighborhood and knocks on the door, and Joe Martin answers. And says, "What the hell are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm telling people about my fight. I'm going to be on TV for anything." He goes, you get paid the same $5, no matter how many people watch." He said, "Yeah, but I want to be famous." And Ali always had that quest for, that appetite for fame from a very early age. And maybe my favorite story about that, something so telling. This is another one of these great myths. How many people know the story that Ali used to race the school bus every day? He's trained to be a boxer. He gave up soft drinks. He gave up sweets. He wanted to prove that he was going to be the heavyweight champion of the world someday, even though he only weighed 85 pounds at that point. And he started racing the bus to school every day. So this is one of those myths. I don't know if it's true or not. I start calling around. Robert Caro, the great biographer of LBJ, always says you have to ask your interview subjects, what was it like to be in the room? Not just who was in the room, where were they sitting, how were they sitting? If they're on the couch, are they on the edge of the seat, or are they laying back on the couch? As much as possible, put your reader in that room. So I wanted to put the reader on that bus. Was Ali wearing gym clothes or school clothes? Was he wearing tennis shoes or boots? Was it a school bus or a city bus? Did the students on the bus lower the windows and yelled at Cassius when he was running this? So I called one of Ali's classmates, I asked him some of these questions, and said it was a city bus. And a couple days later, something about that was bothering me. I called him back, his name was Owen Sitgraves. I said, "Mr. Sitgraves, you said it was a city bus, right?" He said, "Yeah, 10 cents to ride." I said, "Something about that's been bothering me. Doesn't a city bus stop? Like every block?" He said, "Yeah, stopped every block. And we transferred at Chestnut to another bus." I said, "So you said Cassius was racing the bus." He said, "I didn't say he was racing it. I said he was running alongside it. He stopped every block when the bus stopped. And when we transferred, he waited with us for the next bus." So I said, "So he wasn't really doing it for the exercise, was he, Mr. Sitgraves?" And he just laughed. He said, "Oh, no, he was just doing it to entertain us. He thought it was fun and make sure everybody was looking at him all the time. Sometimes he would jump up on the window and grab onto the window and swing along the side of the bus for a couple blocks just to make us laugh." And that was so key to understanding this guy's personality. You'll see it every stage of his life, from childhood to worldwide celebrity, to retirement, even to old age. I think more than anything else, he needed affection. More than fame, more than money, more than even respect. And as we'll see as I tell you a little bit more about his life, he goes to the Olympics. He becomes the Golden Gloves champion. He makes it to the Olympics in Rome in 1960. And something really miraculous happens there. He's not expected to win gold. He's not considered a great prospect. He's certainly not a prospect to be a heavyweight because he's small, he's fast, he doesn't hit hard. But as soon as he gets there, even before he starts winning, he becomes the mayor of the Olympic Village. People from all over the world, people who can't speak any English, they see something in this kid. There's some magnetism about him. Everyone wants their picture taken with him. The newspaper reporters are saying, "We really hope this kid can fight because he'd be great for the sport. He's just like sunshine. with a snappy jab. He is so much fun to be around, and he wins the gold medal. And when he comes back to the States, he won't take that damn medal off. Everywhere he goes, he's on the streets, not just in Louisville, this is the picture taken outside his high school, Central High. That's his brother, Rudy on the right. Rudy's in like 95% of every picture ever taken of Muhammad Ali. He's the shadow. He's so in love with this new level of attention. He walks down the street in New York City when he comes back from Rome saying, "Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?" Showing everybody the medal. He gets a fake newspaper printed up that says Cassius Clay takes heavyweight championship from Floyd Patterson. He is just so in love with this escalating level of fame, and he discovers that calling attention to himself is actually good for his career. He sees Gorgeous George, the wrestler, in action, and sees how Gorgeous George provokes the fans, actually tries to be obnoxious, and that it draws more people to his events. And he thinks that's good. If it works for a white guy, it'll work even better for a black guy. So he decides he's going to be obnoxious. He's going to predict the rounds in which he's going to defeat his opponents. He's going to humiliate them, which sounds like fun. But back in those days, sportsmanship was something considered important. You didn't gloat, you didn't brag, you didn't pick on your opponents, and certainly black athletes didn't do it. Black athletes were supposed to be humble. Joe Louis, the greatest heavyweight of all time perhaps, was not allowed. His manager said, "You are not allowed to raise your hands over when you win. After you've knocked out a white man, you go back to your corner politely and you act as if nothing has happened. Because if you gloat over beating a white man, there's going to be hell to pay for that." That's the conditions in which black athletes were expected to perform. And Ali is challenging that a little bit, even at the age of 18, 19. And it works. By the age of 21, he's lined up for a fight with this man, Sonny Liston, the heavyweight champ, the baddest man on earth. This guy has just destroyed everyone he's faced. The last 3 opponents have lasted something like a total of 90 seconds. The last 3 fights have lasted something like 90 seconds. And everybody says, "Well, this Cassius Clay, it's been fun, but it's over now." He's not. Cassius Clay is undersized. He doesn't hit hard. He's not a real heavyweight. Everybody assumes that he's going to be destroyed. In fact, the only question among sports writers covering the fight is whether Ali is going to be knocked out in the first round or killed in the first round. And Bob Lipsyte, the sports writer for the New York Times, told me that he actually was told by his editor to figure out the quickest route to the hospital and make sure that he knew how to get there fast so that he could get there before any other reporters to see if Ali was alive or dead on arrival. And this fight becomes something like a mission to Ali, not just because it's his chance to win the heavyweight championship and to fulfill his dream, but by now he's also beginning to explore the Nation of Islam. He's discovered this group that white Americans consider to be a cult, or maybe even worse, maybe even the FBI calls it a terrorist organization. The Nation of Islam takes what Ali's father said and takes it a step further. It says that white integration is a waste of time. Don't bother with this hooey that Martin Luther King is talking about. The civil rights movement is never going to work. The only way forward for African Americans is to be independent, to start their own businesses, to educate themselves, to learn discipline, to eat right, and eventually to force the United States of America to carve out a chunk of territory that we can occupy on our own as a separate nation. And that will happen. If it doesn't happen through civil ways, it will happen with a war of Armageddon, when all of white society will be destroyed by spaceships. This is what Ali begins to find attractive. He begins to study the writings of Elijah Muhammad, and he becomes friends with Malcolm X. Malcolm X becomes his mentor, and Malcolm X tells him that this fight with Sonny Liston is more than a fight for a boxing championship. This is a fight to see which is superior, the crescent or the cross, Islam or Christianity. And Ali does not tell the press, does not tell the world that he is beginning to explore this dangerous notion. But when he beats Sonny Liston, when he stops Sonny Liston, and this is an unbelievable moment, when you see Ali get in the ring with Liston and you see him throwing that jab and befuddling Liston, and he's too fast for Liston to hit, and Liston starts to get frustrated. I don't know if there's anybody here who boxes, any boxers in the room? Ali was a different kind of a boxer, and nobody thought he had a chance because he He didn't keep his hands up to protect his head the way a boxer is supposed to. He didn't duck punches. He was so quick that he could just move at the last second and move his head and avoid those punches. And after a while, Liston becomes tired and frustrated, and it's clear that Ali is not just fast, he's big and strong, and he's hurting Liston. And when the fight's over, Ali jumps up and down the ring. He says, "I am the greatest of all time. I told you. I am the greatest. I'm the king of the world. I talk to God." And the next day, at this press conference, he announces that he's a member of the Nation of Islam. And he makes this really important speech. It's one of the most important speeches in the history of American sports. It's his Declaration of Independence. He says, "I am not a Christian anymore. That was a religion that was forced on my people during slavery. I don't have to take it. My name, Cassius Clay, that's a slave name. That's like a cattle brand. Somebody owned my people and they called them Clay. But I don't have to keep that name. I don't have to be what you want me to be. I don't have to say what you want me to say. I don't have to do what you expect me to do. I'm free. Get used to it." Well, people are not prepared to get used to it. The white press just says he's crazy. They say he's joined a cult. They say that he wants to change his name, but they refuse to acknowledge it. They continue to call him Cassius Clay for years to come. And it becomes difficult for him even to get fights. He is so unpopular. He's booed everywhere he goes. Sonny Liston was unpopular because he was a thug, because he beat up police officers, he'd been convicted of crimes. But Ali takes this unpopularity to a whole new level. You think Colin Kaepernick, what he's going through now, is tough? Nothing compared to what Ali went through. He was the most unpopular man in America. And then it got worse, because he was ruled eligible for the draft. At first, he failed his IQ test because of his dyslexia. He was not eligible for the draft. When they lowered the standard and he became eligible, he announced that he won't go. First he said, and it gets a little complicated, first he said, "I won't go because I failed my IQ test, right? I was too stupid for them last week, now I'm smarter." Then he said, "Well, I don't want to go. You can take my tax dollars. I'm making a lot of money. Go buy some tanks. Go buy some bomber jets." Then he says, "Well, this war is racist. Why should I go fight for a country that treats me like a second-class citizen? Black soldiers are dying in disproportionate numbers over there. If you're rich and you're white, you can have your daddy's lawyer get you out of serving over there. Say you got shin splints or bone spurs or whatever." And then he says, "I got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. Why should I go over there and kill some of my dark-skinned brothers?" And then finally he begins to talk about the religious side of it. He says, "My religion forbids me from fighting in secular wars. I'm a conscientious objector." That's the argument he eventually takes to court and loses. He's convicted. There he is with Elijah Muhammad and Rudy in the picture again. And he's convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, stripped of his heavyweight title, stripped of his license to box in all 50 states. Now you might ask yourself, just because he's convicted, he's appealing his conviction, he's out, he's free, you might ask yourself, why can't he box while he's appealing his conviction? There's no law that says a convicted felon can't box. In fact, I think like a third of the heavyweights were convicted felons. But it's flat out prejudice. It's anger, it's hostility at the fact that we don't like this kid, what he's saying. We don't like his religion, we don't like his attitude, and we're not going to let you play in our backyard. We're not going to let you make money. So Ali gives up 3.5 years of his prime years as a fighter. And I should mention, we always talk about the fact that he gave up millions of dollars of income, endorsements, that he gave up 3.5 years of fighting. He didn't know it was going to be 3.5 years. He believed it was permanent. He thought that his boxing career was over, and he was offered a deal. The Pentagon said, "Box a few exhibitions for us. We won't send you to Vietnam. Box a few exhibitions for the troops. We'll let you continue your career." He wouldn't do it. Wouldn't even think about it. He said, "I'd rather face a firing squad before I compromise my religion, my beliefs." And this is the moment when Ali really becomes a hero to many people, but first he becomes even more hated. As the war at this point is still relatively popular, as the war becomes more unpopular, as protests begin to spread across college campuses, as civil rights activists like Martin Luther King begin to speak out against Vietnam, then the attitude towards Ali begins to change. But at first, even Martin Luther King mocked young Muhammad Ali, said he should stick to boxing, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Only over time do we begin to see, and even over time people begin to recognize that even if they don't like his beliefs, he sure is sincere about it because he's sacrificing, he's suffering, he's giving up the thing he loves the most, that he's best at. He's giving up the heavyweight championship, which is, you gotta remember, boxing at the time, to be the heavyweight champion was to be a world figure. This was not like being the Super Bowl MVP. This was something 100 times greater. The heavyweight champion was like Superman to Americans in the 60s. And Ali was the most hated heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson, and maybe more hated than Jack Johnson ever was. And he even models, he talks about Jack Johnson. He says he wants to be Jack Johnson. He wants to be the N word that white people wake up in their nightmares sweating about. That's what he wants to do. He wants to scare people. And he does. 1970, he's granted a license to box in Atlanta. 1971, he's granted a license to box in New York. His case is still under appeal, goes all the way to the Supreme Court, will eventually be reversed on a technicality. But here's the most important thing that happens. In 1971, he gets a chance to fight again. Joe Frazier, Madison Square Garden. I'm guessing some people in the room remember this fight. The fight of the century, the only time in history two undefeated heavyweight champions have met in the ring. And I would argue that this moment that you see in this photo is the most important moment in Ali's career. In the 15th round, after a brutal fight in which both men have just been demolished, you can see Ali's jaw in that picture is swollen to the size of an apple. In the 15th round, Joe Frazier reaches back with a left hook, one of the best left hooks anyone in boxing has ever had, and just lands it straight on Ali's jaw. Ali goes down, and as soon as he hits the ground, he bounces right back up. He said later that he was unconscious on the way down, and when his rear end hit the ground, that woke him up. And he bounced right back up. He finishes the fight, loses to Frazier in a decision. Is hospitalized immediately afterwards for concern that he has a broken jaw. And I believe it's in that moment when he gets back up that Americans begin to look at him differently. It's 1971. Almost everybody can see that the war was a bad idea. A lot of people are really relieved that the civil rights movement has come off of the streets, that the protests, they're eager for a little bit of a resolution to the insanity of the 60s. Bob Dylan has gone electric, and Muhammad Ali is a boxer again. And a tough MF. You got to admit, no matter what you think of him politically, racially, religiously, that is a tough dude to get up from that punch. And he begins working his way back toward another shot at the heavyweight championship. He stops talking quite so much about religion. Elijah Muhammad is ill, the Nation of Islam is weakening, and Ali even seems relieved not to have to talk so much about politics and religion and to be a boxer again. And it's the 70s, it's the disco age. Everybody's having fun, and Ali is clowning around on TV with Howard Cosell. He's becoming a lovable figure. Some people, especially some of the black activists, were frustrated by this. Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young told me that they loved Ali of the 60s and they had mixed feelings about the Ali of the 70s. It was hard for them to see him becoming this, the star and clowning around with Johnny Carson and appearing on TV sitcoms. It was difficult for them to know how to feel about that. But Ali wants to be the heavyweight champion again. He's enjoying the celebrity. He's enjoying the money that's coming in. And he finally gets his shot at the heavyweight championship again in 1974, facing George Foreman. Big bad George, who's I think 5 or 6 years younger than Ali, who's like Sonny Liston, just been destroying his opponents. Frazier beat Ali, well, Foreman just destroyed Frazier, knocked him down I think 6 times in the first 2 rounds before winning the fight. And everybody assumes that this is going to be the end of Ali's career. Ali is now 32 years old. He's clearly slowed down. He's not the same fighter. He's taking a lot of punches. He's not fast enough to avoid the punches the way he did as a young man. And for reasons too complicated to explain, well, because of money, This fight takes place in Zaire. Maybe that's not too complicated to explain. Don King got the dictator, the ruler of Zaire, Mobutu, to pay millions and millions of dollars to bring the fight over there. Most of those millions went into Don King's pockets. And this becomes not just a fight for the heavyweight championship, but a referendum on who's the baddest black man in the world. And Ali is considered a huge underdog. I have to pause before I tell you the outcome of the fight, which you probably know, just to tell you a funny story. George Foreman said to me, I was drugged before that fight. That's why I lost that fight. My own manager drugged me. And I said, George, you really believe your own manager drugged you before that fight? He said, I don't believe it, I know it for a fact. And he said, I'll tell you another thing. Before the fight, my manager came to me and said, we need $10,000 to give the referee, cash, to make sure it's a fair fight. And I gave the ref $10,000 cash. And I found out later that Ali's people gave him even more. They gave him $20,000. So I called Gene Kilroy, Ali's manager, and I said, Gene, George says that he gave the ref $10,000 cash before the fight, and that you guys gave the ref $20,000. Kilroy just exploded. He said, that's ridiculous. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. We only gave him $5,000. That's the boxing world for you. But the other great story about this fight is that Ali used to mock his opponents. He was merciless. He was cruel. He called Joe Frazier and Uncle Tom to the point that it really hurt. Joe never really got over it. Just for kids were teased, because Ali had the microphone. Ali was the one who was always on television. So if Ali goes on the Wide World of Sports and says Joe Frazier's and Uncle Tom, then Joe Frazier's kids get teased at school the next day. So Ali's flying over to Zaire to face Foreman, and he says to his manager, Gene Kilroy, if I call him an Uncle Tom, are they going to know what that is in Africa? Kilroy said, I don't think so. I don't think they're going to know what an Uncle Tom is. So Ali says, well, who do they hate? And Kilroy says, oh, they hate the Belgians. That's obvious. In Zaire, the Belgians enslaved them, raped them, killed them, chopped off their heads and put them on sticks. You ever see that movie? Okay, that's enough. Ali says, gets off the plane. Thousands of people on the tarmac to greet him. I am the greatest of all time. George Foreman is a Belgian. And Foreman arrives the next day and cannot figure out why everybody hates him already. What did he do? He's miserable in Zaire. And Ali is just happy as can be, because here's a whole new continent that's waiting to fall in love with him. And they do. They start chanting everywhere he goes, Ali Bomaye, which means Ali kill him. And by the time of the fight, he's ecstatic. Foreman is miserable, just wants to get the hell out of there. And he beats Foreman. He becomes the heavyweight champion of the world again. Go home and watch it on YouTube. It's a great fight. And after the fight, Elijah Muhammad calls Ali and says, you've done everything. Elijah Muhammad never wanted him to box. The Nation of Islam preached that sport and play and even music were frivolous. Louis Farrakhan was forced to give up a promising music career because it wasn't allowed. But he made this exception for Muhammad Ali. And now he said it's time to stop. You should come back and preach and join. You've proven everything there is to prove. And Ali, unfortunately, cannot stop. I wish this were the peak, this were the climax of my book, and that he got out. But it's 1974, he did not get out. He continued to fight, he continued to take more punches. I counted every punch that Ali was hit with over the course of his career. I worked with a statistics company that monitors boxing fights live on TV and counts the fights. We went back and watched film of every one of Ali's fights. We counted the punches. And in the second half of his career, he's getting out-punched dramatically. He's winning these fights, but he's taking more punishment than his opponents. He's taking more punishments than he's given. And I calculated that and he also comes to believe that he can train himself to absorb more punishment. Like you can build up calluses. He thinks if he takes more shots to the head during his sparring sessions, it'll be harder to knock him out. So he asks his sparring partners just to hit him in the head, and he doesn't defend himself because he thinks it's going to build up his resistance. I calculated that he probably took 200,000 punches over the course of his career. And he continues to fight in the 70s, into the late 70s, and he becomes a celebrity and a spokesperson, and in some ways, taking commercials that are embarrassing, like Decon Roach-Fogger, and he's having trouble when, if you watch the TV commercial, he can't say Decon Roach-Fogger. The F comes out slurred every time, and it's because his speech is beginning to deteriorate. He's beginning to suffer cognitive damage from all these punches, and he goes on far too long. He boxes until 1981, loses to Larry Holmes, loses to Trevor Berbick, and finally retires. And it's a sad ending. He kind of disappears for a decade after that. In the 1980s and even into the 90s, you can hire Ali to come to a trade show for $3,000, and he'll sit at the trade show booth and sign autographs. And I heard the same story over and over. We hired him for 2 hours. There was still a line. He stayed 6 hours. He wouldn't leave until every single person had an autograph. He always loved being around people. When he was bored, he would just dial the phone. He would open the phone book and call someone and say, "Hey, do you want to come hang out? This is Muhammad Ali." He would just get in the car and drive to a hospital. Sometimes he would just get out of his car and stand in the middle of the intersection and wait to see how long it would take for traffic to stop in all 4 directions and for people to come out and play with it. He was all his life insatiable for that attention. But it was depressing to him in the 80s and 90s. He couldn't really go on TV anymore. He didn't like the way he looked and the way he sounded. His speech was slurred. His gait was slowed. And I think these were the toughest years in his life in many ways. And then something miraculous happened, and I'm sure almost everybody remembers this. In 1996, no one knew who was going to be lighting the Olympic torch. It was live on TV from Atlanta, and the stadium is filled, and the TV announcers are sort of speculating, who's it going to be? Who's going to light the torch that begins the games? Was it going to be Evander Holyfield, who was from Atlanta? Was it going to be Hank Aaron, perhaps? And then, from out of the shadows at the top of the stadium comes this figure dressed all in white. And when people can see that it's Ali, you don't hear a roar, you don't hear applause, you hear a gasp. Again, you can go home and watch this on YouTube. It's astonishing. And Ali comes out and his hand is shaking. And the crowd remains silent. See, like, my God, we haven't seen him in so long. And he looks so frail. And he has a difficult time lighting the flame. It looks for a while like the flame is going to wick up his arm and burn him. And when he finally gets the torch lit, then everyone exhales, and you start to hear this applause and this roar start to go through the crowd, and then the chant, Ali, Ali, Ali. It's this beautiful moment, and what was so powerful about it, I think, was that Ali was not afraid to let people see him this way. He knew that he was not going to look like a heavyweight champion. He's only 44 years old. And he's willing to let the world see him this way. And the next day he gives an interview, and he says, you know what? People are going to love me more now. Because we all get old, we all die. And I'm just showing people that even the great Muhammad Ali, even the greatest of them all, I'm going to die too. I'm not the man I used to be, and that's okay. And that's going to make people love me more. He senses that, and it comes true. In some ways it comes true in unfortunate ways as well. It really is a source of comfort and joy for people to see this great man, to see his modesty after all those years of bragging. But at the same time, there's a danger in it, I think. Stanley Crouch, the great writer, said that Ali, as a young man in the 60s, was a grizzly bear. He was dangerous. He was unpredictable. You didn't get too close to him because you might get your head chopped off. By the 70s, he becomes kind of a circus bear. He's still dangerous, but he's entertaining. By the last chapter of his career, by the third act, he's like a teddy bear, and all we want to do is hug him. And I think it's true, but I also think it's unfortunate in a way, because the Ali we should remember is the grizzly bear. He's the one who changed the world. He's the one who challenged us to think about what we could do to be better people, to be a better country. He's the one who dared to stand up for what he believed in. And I think the teddy bear is important too, but we shouldn't hug him and forget what came before that, what had to come before that. So you might imagine, this is the first time I've ever written a book about someone who was still alive as I was writing it. So I had access to all the people who were closest to Ali. And I also had a chance or an ambition, of course, to meet Ali and to talk to him about this book and to ask him some questions. But it was difficult. He hadn't given an interview in 20 years. So when I set out to try to meet him, I told all the people I was interviewing, please tell his family that I'd like to talk to him. I went to a fundraiser. Ali had appeared at the same fundraiser for 20 years running. He'd never missed one. I went, and he didn't come because he was sick that day. And I met his wife, Lonnie, and I said, Lonnie, I'm writing this book, and I'm just trying to make this the book he deserves. I want this to be a book that you'll be proud of, that your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and that people will read for generations to come to understand who this man really was. And she said, oh, well, you should come meet him. And I said, yes, I really like that. How about tonight after the ceremony? She said, no, he's really sick. How about tomorrow? He's not going to be in good shape for tomorrow, but we'll try. So I got back home, and I wrote her a letter, and I sent her some photos that I found of Ali as a child. As I was writing this letter, my daughter, who was 5 at the time, came into my office. My office is in the laundry room. And she said, what are you doing, Daddy? And I said, I'm writing a letter to Muhammad Ali and his wife, Lonnie. And she said, oh, can I write a letter to Muhammad Ali? And she hears me talking about Muhammad Ali all the time, but she doesn't really know who he is, and she thinks it's kind of like a myth. She doesn't believe that boxing is real, because nobody would ever hit another person on purpose. But I said, sure, here's a piece of paper. She asked me how to spell Muhammad, and she wrote, Dear Muhammad, my daddy really loves you. Do you love my daddy? Love, Lola. I thought, oh, that's really good. Lonnie's gonna love this. So I stuck it in the envelope, and 3 days later, my phone rings. It's Lonnie. It's the first time she's ever called me without blocking her caller ID. So now I can text her. This is big. And she says, that letter was so sweet from your daughter. When you come to see us, you should really bring her, because Muhammad loves kids. The only thing he loved more than kids was like watching was himself, I think. He loved kids. So I said, well, it just so happens that Lola and I are going to be in Phoenix in a few weeks. We're coming out there to visit some friends, and we can stop by if that's all right. I said, not an interview, no tape recorder, no cameras. I just want to meet him. I just want to tell him that I'm writing this book and shake his hand. And she said, okay, that's fine. Call me when you get to Phoenix. We had no plans to go to Phoenix, I'll be honest with you. I booked tickets. I told Lola, hey, we're going on an adventure. We get to Phoenix, and we call, and Lonnie says he's not feeling well. We wait till the next day, he's still not feeling well. I said, Lonnie, would it be okay if we just came over to the house? We have some presents. My daughter had colored some pictures of Muhammad. So we went over to the house. We spent 2 hours in the house with Lonnie, and Muhammad was in the next room. I could hear the TV. The whole time I'm there, I'm sitting on the couch, and I just have this dream, I keep thinking, if I stay long enough, and if I can just stay in this house and stall, he's going to come out of his bedroom, and he's going to tap me on the shoulder, and it's going to be, he's going to be poking jabs at me, and, it's going to be great. But he doesn't. He didn't come out of his room. And I left, and heartbroken. Lola was excited because we get to go back to the hotel and swim. But then a couple months later, Lonnie called me, and she said, he's feeling a lot better, and we're going to be in Louisville for an award dinner, and you should come. So I drove down to Louisville and spent the day with Rahman, and took him out to lunch again at the Chinese restaurant. And I had a few hours to kill before the dinner. I called Lonnie and asked if I could come over to the house, and she said, no, he's resting before the award dinner tonight. And I had a few hours to kill, and I decided to go for a run. I jog a lot. I was going to go for a run today, but this just sucks. So I went for a run, and I decided I'm going to run along the route that Ali used to run along. And then as I'm running, I'm thinking, you're an idiot. What do you think you're going to learn from running in Ali's path? You're a white guy. 60 years later, you think you're going to somehow understand what it was like to grow up? Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. in Jim Crow, Louisville? What kind of a fool are you? And it was in that moment that I finally figured out what I was going to say to Ali if I got to meet him. That run really helped me. So I got to the award banquet that night. Lonnie let me in a little early before the crowds, because once the crowds came in, I would never get in. I went straight to the table with Lonnie, and Lonnie introduced me to Muhammad, and I was so nervous. I put my hand on his arm. He didn't reach up. I just put my hand here, and I leaned into his ear, and I said, my name is Jonathan Hagen. I'm writing a book about you, and it's the most important thing I've ever done. professionally, and I'm trying so hard to do your story honor, and I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and I want to know what you think the last word should be. It should be yours. And I waited, and I listened, and he didn't answer. And I was crushed at first, relieved to have at least met him and looked him in the eye, but crushed that I didn't get any words from him, that I didn't get any guidance for how I should end my book and how I should tell this story. But as I thought about it, a little time went by, I thought, Ali never made it easy for anybody. He never made it easy to understand him. He made up his own rules as he went along. He certainly didn't make it easy on his wives or his children over the years. And he wasn't going to make it easy for me. It was my book, it was his life. And ultimately it's my job to make sense of it and to try to answer the question that Dick Gregory put to me. What made this kid think he could be special? And I came to the conclusion as I wrote the book, as I wrote the pages, and Ali died a few months after that meeting. Lonnie said he heard me when I spoke to him, and he wanted me to come read him the book because there was still nothing he loved more than hearing about himself. But I didn't get to read him any of the book. But the conclusion I came to is that Ali was special because, for reasons perhaps incomprehensible, he never believed he had to follow the rules. He never believed he had to accept the world as it was presented to him. And we're taught in the book of Genesis that we're partners with God in the creation of the universe. And that means we have a responsibility to change what we don't like and to fight for what we believe in. And Ali always stood up for what he believed in, even when it was sometimes contradictory, even when it was controversial, even when he was sometimes wrong, even when it was sometimes ugly. He got up when he got knocked down. And he, I think perhaps most importantly, always presented his true self. The pianist Thelonious Monk once said that the real genius is the one who's most like himself. That was Muhammad Ali. And when you live that kind of a life, true to yourself, true to your beliefs, that's when you get to call yourself the greatest of all time. Thank you very much. And we have some time for questions. I hope you have some good ones for me. Yes, sir. Oh, we have a microphone. Great.
Before I ask my question, I was able to meet Muhammad Ali on several occasions in 1977 and 78 at Deer Lake at his training camp. My father in the 40s was a boxer and he became a good friend of Angelo Dundee, so we were able to go into the training camp whenever we wanted to. I always found him to be very cordial. Ali was very cordial. He was very dignified in the ring. He was, he did his thing. But after he was done his sparring, he'd come out and he would talk to everyone. He'd take pictures with all the kids, and he was a very, very gentle person compared to being in the ring. My question is, how do you think his refusal to go into the army affected his demeanor and his life in general?
That's a big question. I think that he never got angry about it. In fact, he was asked when his conviction was reversed and when he was reinstated in boxing if he was thinking about suing for lost wages and anything else, and he said no. The government was just doing what they believed in, and I was doing what I believed in. Why would I sue over that? He never held a grudge, was never vindictive, and I think that the biggest effect was that he came back a slower fighter, and I like to think that if he hadn't missed those 3.5 years, he would have boxed successfully for maybe another 4 or 5 years and retired a lot sooner, maybe, who knows. But when he came back, the biggest effect was that he just was a lot slower and he started taking a lot more punches, and he had to adopt a new strategy to find success in the ring, and that strategy involved getting hit in the head a lot, unfortunately. Any other questions? I know you got some. Yes? You want to know what Ali's dog's name was? You gotta read the book.
Just an inquiry. I somehow remember that there was somebody from Erie who did legal work for Muhammad Ali? Are you aware of that?
Oh yeah, Ron D. Nicola. I'm not sure. Was it from Erie? I think he was from around here. Yeah, he was a huge help in getting Ali's finances back in order after some other people had taken great advantage of Ali. And Ron D. Nicola was one of them.
Show him back up in politics.
Oh yeah? Yeah, he was one of the good guys for Ali.
I wish to find out where you put Muhammad Ali in the civil rights movement. His influence, was he as influential just being an outlet in the civil rights movement?
It's a really interesting question because he would tell you that he was actually opposed to the civil rights movement, the mainstream civil rights movement, which was seeking integration. Ali was opposed to integration. He thought it was a mistake for black and white people to live in the same neighborhood and for black people to marry white people. He was against it. So what he did for black power and for equality of life is another issue. And I think on that front, he was hugely influential. If you look at the Black Power movement began to use Ali's slogans. They began to say, "I am the greatest." And that alone, just that message, I talked to a lot of young African Americans, people who were teenagers during Ali's career, who said the fact that there was a black man who could go around calling himself the greatest, when everyone else was telling us we were far from the greatest, we were inferior, that was a really powerful message. And another thing that Dick Gregory pointed out to me that I think was so important, this is really a key to his influence. In the 60s, almost every black man who was attempting to speak out had to speak out through a filter that was controlled by the white man. So Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, Stokely Carmichael, for them to be quoted on the nightly news, for them to be quoted in the newspaper, their words were taken and processed by a white reporter and another white editor, and those white people decided which words. So if Martin Luther King gave a speech, it was white people decided which part of that speech made it into the paper the next day, or which part of that speech made it on the CBS Evening News. Not so for Muhammad Ali. He could stand up in the ring after a fight on live television and say whatever he wanted, and hundreds of millions of people around the world would hear him. And that gave him a kind of a power that no one else had. So when he said, "All praise to Allah," suddenly a lot of Americans who'd never heard of Allah went and looked it up. Who is this guy he's talking about? Is that the same as God? Right? Or when he stands up and says, "I got no quarrel with the Viet Cong," and it's on live TV, it's a different story. That really was hugely important. So, like I said with Ali, nothing is easy to put into easily defined. It's very hard to rank him and to say as a civil rights leader, because a lot of what he did with the Nation of Islam, some would say was counterproductive for the civil rights movement, but no doubt a huge impact in a lot of ways.
Those years I spent over in that was a big impact. All they were saying. They didn't tell us on armed forces radio. We had to get it from home and the newspapers and everything else. And we had divisions in the unit. The civil rights, Muhammad Ali. But most of us lined up, we're here because we had to come. We wish we had the courage that Ali had. We came back and went back to work and tried to change things. But he was a major factor all through that process. Even the DC used him, had him on posters.
Really?
Yes. Why are you fighting us? We never called you nigger. And they put a poster up and Ali would be standing there saying the same book.
Wow, thank you. That's fascinating.
You're welcome.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to hang around and sign books, and you can ask me your private, personal questions, the ones you're too shy. Oh, we got one more. Hang on, don't leave yet. This is the last question's always the best. The last question's always the best.
So do you think that his gold medal was in the Ohio River?
Another one of these great myths. The story goes that Ali was denied service in a restaurant, complained about it, was wearing his Olympic gold medal, said, "Look, I'm the gold medalist. How can you deny me service in this restaurant?" Was chased out of the restaurant by a gang of white motorcyclists, a motorcycle gang. And as he was fleeing, so angry about this treatment, threw his medal into the Ohio River. There's a guy in Ohio who has been diving and charting every square inch of the soil beneath the bridge trying to find that medal, and he is wasting his time because that never happened. Ali made up that, Ali's ghostwriter made that story up for Ali's autobiography. And when Ali was asked about it, he said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's in the book." "Oh, well, I didn't read the book." And Ali's brother Rahman told me that Ali lost the medal, just flat out lost it. Maybe he lent it to a girl one day. He often would lend his stuff to girls. Maybe he didn't get it back, maybe he just misplaced it. But Rahman said he remembered searching all over the house for that medal, and it definitely was not hurled into the river. So that's one of those, it's one of the most famous stories about Ali, but it's almost certainly not true, unfortunately. All right, thanks. I'll be outside signing books. Thank you for coming.